Okay, so let's get going. And as I said, my name is Gary Christian, the President of Drug Free Australia. And what we're looking at today is Australia and its experience with harm reduction. And what we have seen within Australia is vastly increased deaths. This has been the story of what we've had in this country. And we're going to look at the data which is behind that. So back in 1985, Australia was the first country in the world to be able to introduce harm reduction as part of its official federal drug policy or national drug policy. And what we saw is at that time, they named the policy harm minimisation, and then over the next 13 years, as measured by various household surveys, which you see on the right of the screen, we saw amphetamine increase over those 13 years to the 1998 survey. We saw cannabis increase 300%, cocaine use increased by 400%, ecstasy increased 750%, and heroin increased by 300%. These were very substantial increases in drug use that we saw. And so by 1998, it was 22% of Australians that were using illicit drugs. That was 5 times the global average. And opiate deaths over that period, by the time we got to 1999, the year after that survey, which is where drugs peaked, at 1,116 deaths. You'll see that over on the screen to the right. Opiate deaths by that time had quadrupled over that period of time. The picture that you have of Australia is that we were leading the world in terms of illicit drug use, as seen in this graph over here. And we were followed fairly closely by New Zealand. Now, New Zealand had done what we had done in 1985. In 1987, they copied what Australia was doing with harm reduction and made it a central plank of their drug policy. And here are these two countries that are leading the world with harm reduction, well ahead of the US, which is the fifth one here, and the UK and Ireland, which you have there. And again, what you see with the drug-related deaths is that they're almost becoming exponential in terms of the curve. They're increasing at a very high rate. Now, Australian attitudes in light of all of this is that Australians very much disapprove of illicit drug use. And again, this comes from the household surveys, the same surveys which measure our drug use within Australia. And you notice that in 2022, 2023, that we have cannabis is tolerated or it is approved of, recreational cannabis use, that would be by 23% of Australians. However, back in 2007, it was only 6.6. You can see that the cannabis legalization industry has very much so put the work in to be able to influence Australians on that attitude. However, Australian attitudes are very much against drug use on most everything else. Only 5% approve the use of ecstasy. Only about 2% the use of ice and speed, methamphetamine. When it comes to cocaine, only 3% approve of its use, meaning that 97% do not approve of its use. And heroin, 1.3% approve of it. 99% of Australians do not approve of the use. They do not give their approval to the use of these drugs. So this is where we sit as a nation when it comes to these things. Now, in 1998, there was pretty much a strong public outcry against the rising deaths within Australia. And at that time, we had a new federal government that had come in, and it said that it was going to establish a policy that would reduce drug use within Australia. And they called that policy tough on drugs. And what you see here is a graph of all the different kinds of drugs. You can see over on the left, that alcohol, which is not illicit, but all the other ones are illicit, illegal drugs. And this top line here is opiates or opioids. And you can see what happened under tough on drugs, that there was a major reduction in drug use. And we're going to see why that was the case. So tough on drugs actually quadrupled the drug policy budget to 0.41% of GDP. And here is Australia having increased its drug budget up something closer to Sweden, which had a very strong budget, and the US at that time. And the elements within tough on drugs, which seemed to be the strongest, was the Australian Federal Police interdiction of drugs before they even got to our border. Other elements within tough on drugs was very strong prevention, school education that you see across here, and a lot of money went into rehab so that people could get rehab readily if they wanted to get off drugs. Now, what we saw in terms of a reduction in use was quite substantial. Even the United Nations took note and congratulated Australia. 39% reduction in drug use from 22% in 1998 of Australians taking illicit drugs down to 13.4%. Then in 2007, we actually had a new government come in that decided that they wanted to scrap. They were the opposition to the party that had brought tough on drugs. They decided they wanted to scrap tough on drugs. They wanted to move the emphasis to alcohol and binge drinking amongst young people. And they got rid of the approach. They got rid of the prevention. They took the money out of rehab, and they put harm minimization or harm reduction as the central focus of drug policy within Australia again. What we saw then was that opioids started to go up in an ever-increasing curve, just as they had before, when harm reduction had previously been the main emphasis, and when prevention and rehab had taken a back seat. And then you look at other drugs, and this green line is cannabinoids. And cannabinoids were increasing by about 600%, very steep curve here as well. Cocaine up 300%, antipsychotics 600%, amphetamines, high speed up 443%. Even legal alcohol went up 273%. And so what we see is that when the emphasis went off recovery, went off prevention, and went back to harm reduction as the central focus, that harm reduction was the tide that lifted all boats within Australia. Now, we can talk about confounders. Why is it that we have this effect that when harm reduction is made predominant, and then you have a very steep increase in drug use, and then very steep decreases in drug use when prevention and recovery are emphasized, and then the increases again as harm reduction is re-prioritized. What are the confounders that are there? And it's interesting that Australia provides what you would call an experimental control, which is bookended by two periods where there is less prevention and recovery and focus on those things, either end, and then this period in the middle where it is made the major emphasis. And you would say that this is a quasi-experimental situation. What is interesting about this in terms of confounders is that there were no changes in definitions of death that could confound this picture. And there were no changes in drug supply. Any changes that we did have were due to the policy itself and not something that was outside it. And of course, there was no correlation with unemployment figures, and you can look at those, and there is no correlation whatsoever. And the fact that there was a lockstep rise and fall of all drugs suggests causality. And so as you see all of these drugs come down with the approach, and then they all start to go back up again, that suggests that harm reduction is causing so many deaths within Australia, and those increases in deaths within this country. So that leads us to the question, what is it about harm reduction interventions that increases deaths within a country where we have seen this very clearly within Australia? And I'm going to put under the microscope for just one moment one particular intervention that we have within Australia, which is called pill testing. And the agitation started for pill testing back in 2016. And now we have agitation for drug checking, and we do have some drug checking in various states. Now, the difference between pill testing and drug checking is pill testing will take an ecstasy pill or some other similar pill and will crush a small part of the pill, analyze it for impurities and other adulterants, other drugs that might be in there. And drug checking just takes powders as different to a pill and checks that to see if there are adulterating drugs which are in the drug of choice of the user. Now, in Australia, we have an excellent science on ecstasy deaths, and MDMA is the particular substance which is psychoactive in an ecstasy pill. And here in Australia, we have had 392 deaths between mid 2000 and mid 2008. This is the study that was produced in 2020, and it built on a study that had been done formally by the pretty much the same institution back in 2009, which had analysed data between 2000 and 2008, 2009, somewhere around that period. Now, what we do know about ecstasy deaths within Australia is that they are not from adulterants in the pills. We know that they're from other causes, and pretty much none of our deaths come from adulterants and impurities in the pill, which pill testing is all about. Here are our figures. 14% over those 18 years died from adverse reactions to MDMA. So that's something like an allergic reaction, to the substance in the ecstasy pill. 48%, this is very important, died from reactions because of synergies between the MDMA in the pill and other substances that were being co-used with the pill, like alcohol. Of course, alcohol is legal, but often they use them with other illegal drugs, such as cocaine or amphetamines, and these reactions cause death. 29% were due to accidents while people were intoxicated on an ecstasy pill. And here it comes the important bit. Only 3 of those 392 deaths were from bad batches where there were other drugs mixed in with the ecstasy and the pill, and they all happened in Melbourne at the one time. And so it is very clear that it is ecstasy, it is MDMA, which is causing just about every one of our ecstasy deaths within Australia. And yet Pill Testing Australia, the body that wanted to do pill testing trials and did them in 2018 and 2019 in Canberra, like every other testing site throughout the world, they treated MDMA as if it wasn't killing anybody. And so if a person fronted up in Canberra at the 2018 trial, they were given a white card if they only found that there was MDMA in their ecstasy pill. And they were given an all clear, you're good to go, white card. If some other substance was found, and I think they found cathinone in just a number of the pills, they said, oh, look, we've come across a deadly drug, and you can see down here it says that if it's going to increase harm, it's going to cause multiple overdoses. If it's going to cause death, we'll give it a red card. And so they gave a red card to a few pills that had another drug in them. Nobody, mind you, was dying, so that batch that was around was not killing anybody. And obviously they were all had the same drug in them. But the important thing is that they were saying that ecstasy was not something that was dangerous, when in actual fact, it was causing most every ecstasy death within Australia. The MDMA was not safe at all and was causing deaths. They should have red carded it. So pill testing in their 2019 evaluation and their trial that they did in Canberra, they actually, uh, decided at that time that they were going to get a proper evaluation done. But they also realised that Drug Free Australia had been educating our politicians in the fact that the deaths were from everything other than impurities in the pill. And so at that time, they decided they'd better change their narrative. And they started to tell Australians through the media, and the media here in Australia is very complicit and very much on board with the harm reduction lobby. And they started to say at that time, all of these deaths are from overdoses. And it's because we don't know how much of purity of MDMA is in the pill. Now, in actual fact, that was totally false. And what you see across here is that the Drug Policy Alliance, this is the flagship harm reduction body within the world, funded by George Soros since 1992, they were honest about MDMA and its relationship to unknown purity or overdoses. And they said this, you see it here, overdoses are extremely rare. And the same message was also taken up by DanceSafe, another major harm reduction outfit in the United States, where they said MDMA-related deaths, stop calling them overdoses. And so what we had was a misinformation campaign that was being foisted upon Australia by Pill Testing Australia. And this is the reason that we have people using so much ecstasy within Australia. Now, as I said before, in 2019, Pill Testing Australia did an evaluation of their pill testing trial in Canberra. And Australian National University brought some academic credentials to that. But in amongst their glowing report, we actually see that this statement, results indicate a small but significant overall rise in patrons' intention to use the tested drug between pre-test and post-test. So somebody came and got their pill tested. It was found to be ecstasy. They got a white card. They were more likely to take that pill after the test than they were before. And it just shows what pill testing does within Australia. It creates confidence in a drug which kills so many Australians. And of course, we are going to see increases in deaths within this country. I think it's illustrative of how harm reduction actually does increase deaths, as we have seen in the Australian experience. Now, I want to move to injecting rooms. We have 2 injecting rooms within Australia, and there has been only one review out there worldwide that has sought a more rigorous science to evaluate injecting rooms, and it is this one here. Which is the RAND Corporation review. And that review found that there were only 2 studies that were positive for injecting rooms, showing that there was a positive benefit. And the first of the studies that it found gave positive benefit was the 2011 Lancet study on mortality around Vancouver's Insight. The result of that study in Lancet was this. They said the fatal overdose rate in the area, which was a 500-metre radius around Insight in Vancouver, decreased by 35% after the opening of that facility. And so that's what the Lancet study found. However, this Lancet study, unbeknown to the RAND Corporation, who should have done a little bit more homework, has been disproven back in 2012. And we'll come back to that in a moment. So interestingly enough, back in 2011, I had come across this set of statistics that you see here. They were produced by the British Columbia Coroner Service, and they actually had the drug deaths from 1997. And here, if you can see my pointer, 1997 through to 2007. That is the actual data of drug deaths in Vancouver. And I've reproduced those up here, so it's easier to see and reverse the order. So 1997 here, 2007 there. And then I have moved those figures into a graph so you can see what is happening for drug-related deaths in British Columbia, first of all. That's the red line there for Vancouver. So this graph correlates to those numbers there. And then I have another set of data, which isn't on this one, and it is for the downtown east side, immediately around Insight. Now, if you look at this graph, you'll notice that drug-related deaths were increasing in every case for the whole of British Columbia. For Vancouver, they're increasing, and for the downtown east side, there are increases. And you look at the numbers here, and they most definitely are increasing. And so how did these researchers come out with a result that said that there was a 35% decrease? Well, what they did was they simply added up all of the drugs on this side of the opening. Here is the opening of Insight in September 2003, and they took a period of 32 months before. And what you can see is that there has been a heroin drought also in Canada, may have been caused by the Australian heroin drought that we had, which we'll come back to. There is this decrease of drug-related deaths, which is happening due to shortages of heroin. And so this is on the decrease. It bottoms out in 2002, the year before Insight opens. But what they did was they took this area of the graph here, all of those drug-related deaths, and compared with those lesser amounts of deaths across there as a block figure. What they didn't do in the Lancet was they did not graph year by year the differences. And so any reader who reads the Lancet report or the Lancet study is none the wiser about the increases in drug use. In other words, this study was either inept or it was a deliberate fraud, one of the two. Rand Corporation did not seem to realise that. Now, we called it out, Drug Free Australia, we called that out in Lancet, and here is our letter that was published in 2012 in the Lancet Journal. And we asked at that time that the editor of the Lancet retract this study because it was either inept or fraudulent. We showed exactly the reason why in that letter. Now, why is it the Lancet did not retract the study? Well, if you look at the authors, Evan Wood and Julio Montana, they actually appear on a page on the internet. This is a drug legalization organization in Canada. And who happens to be on the same scientific board? It is this gentleman here, Sir Richard Horton, who is the editor-in-chief of the Lancet. And so there was a very evidenced conflict of interest. Now, the second study that they appealed to was one that was published back in 2007 and then written up in the Addiction Journal in 2010. And this looked at the reduction in ambulance overdose call-outs after the Sydney injecting room was opened. And the thing that we need to realise about this study is that it was in the context of a heroin drought, which had happened 6 months before the injecting room in Sydney opened. That opened in May of 2001, and the heroin drought hit in pretty much in December of the year 2000. And so it was the kind of thing that could invalidate any study. If you're looking at ambulance overdoses before the heroin drought, of course, they're going to plummet after the heroin drought has hit. And so the people who did, the researchers who did this study, had to be able to compare against the whole of New South Wales and see whether King's Cross did better in reducing ambulance call-outs than the rest of New South Wales. And this bar on the graph here is the rest of New South Wales. That's the one that shows that throughout the whole of New South Wales, there was a 61%, because of the heroin drought, 61% reduction in overdose call-outs. In King's Cross, over here, they actually outperformed the rest of New South Wales. And this was the headline back at the time. the injecting room decreased ambulance call-outs by 80%. Well, in actual fact, that was not true. It was the heroin drought that had reduced ambulance call-outs by 61%, but they had done better in King's Cross, and that is quite important. When we look at operating hours, it does look impressive, but when we go to the hours when the injecting room was closed, a different picture emerges. Within New South Wales, ambulance overdose call-outs reduced by 42% at night, but in the King's Cross area, they reduced by 71%. Okay, so the King's Cross area is outperforming New South Wales, whether the injecting room is open or closed. It doesn't matter. So that there is some other cause other than the injecting room, which is reducing the ambulance overdose call-outs by so much. And the thing that gives it away is the fact that neighbouring Darlinghurst, this is the purple bar on the graph that you can see, neighbouring Darlinghurst is only 200 metres away from the injecting room. That's where that suburb boundary begins. And you notice that it's not performing as it should. It should be equal to the rest of New South Wales. There is no reason why it shouldn't have as bigger reductions in call-outs as the rest of New South Wales, but it doesn't. Why is that so? It just so happens that they had sniffer dogs that were happening in this area here, King's Cross, but the sniffer dogs were not allowed to pass over into neighbouring Darlinghurst, 200 metres away. What was happening was that drug dealers were running across to Darlinghurst and selling their drugs there, and that's where all the overdoses were happening. People would take the drugs as soon as they had bought from the dealer, and they would inject on the streets of Darlinghurst. And so the picture that emerges is that it was the sniffer dogs that were actually decreasing the ambulance overdoses within the King's Cross area. And again, we have a very complete picture that it is not the injecting room that is causing decreases in ambulance overdoses, because at night they're decreasing at an even greater rate. Another fact about the injecting rooms within Australia that needs to be known is that they have massive numbers of overdoses, 63 times the number of overdoses. This is an incredible figure. How do we get to that figure? Well, when people came to register to come into the injecting room for the first time, they gave a record of how many overdoses they had had and how long their injecting career had been. This allows you to establish a rate of overdose for the clients of the injecting room before they entered the room. When they enter the room, the rate of overdoses within the room are 63 times higher than their experience of overdose before they went into the room. And in Melbourne, it is 102 times higher. And of course, this is actually recorded in the reports that have been done, the various studies on the injecting room in Sydney. And this is a table that comes out of the 2010 evaluation, where we have massive rates of overdose. You look at those figures, they are just astronomical. And yet no attention by the reviewers is made to this. They don't even talk about it. They're totally disinterested. Now, why is it that we're having so many overdoses within the room? Here is an ex-client. He is in rehab in Melbourne, and he gives his testimony. This is written testimony, and we have this from a number of people for both the Sydney injecting room and the Melbourne injecting room. And he says this, he says, I can remember times when I had scored drugs on Victoria Street, and I would be on foot. I would always end up in the injecting room. The reason behind this was I knew it was a safe place to use, and it was a perfect environment to test my tolerance and my limits on how much I could take. He goes on a couple of sentences down and says, my honest opinion is if there was no injecting room in Richmond, I can honestly say I would have never relapsed. It was too easy to fall into the pattern of full-blown addiction and roll of the dice on death. These rooms only enabled me to stay on the path of destruction and hopelessness, not the other way around. And so why is it that harm reduction within Australia is increasing deaths, not decreasing deaths, and sharply increasing deaths? It's because it is extending the heroin use of careers of drug users for many years because it gives this false safety. But the careers end up so much longer, and there is so much greater chance for overdose fatalities as a result. Now, needle and syringe programs were brought to Australia in 1985. Again, I said earlier that we had led the world when it came to harm reduction, and this was part of that, the needle and syringe programs. And what most people don't recognize within the prevention community is that these programs do not actually do anything of any significance in bringing down drug-related deaths or morbidity as well. And here is a report that comes from the highest authority, I think, on the planet. It's the Institute of Medicine in the US. And this was a report that they did looking at needle exchange programs in 2006. 1 decade earlier, they had also put out a similar report, and this was before the science had been done on needle and syringe programs. And back at that time, they were very much in favour of needle and syringe programs. So it was interesting to read in 2006, 10 years later, when quite a number of studies had been done on the programs, what the results were. And here were the results. What were the effects on HIV incidence? And they said evidence regarding the effect of needle and syringe exchange on HIV incidence is limited and inconclusive. Now, that was not the message we were getting in Australia. The media was telling us that the needle exchange programs were saving lots of lives, lots of people were not getting HIV, and lots of people were not getting hepatitis C. Now, what did the multiple studies show? Here is their conclusion about hepatitis C. Multiple studies show that needle exchanges do not reduce transmission of hepatitis C. In other words, despite Australia having the best needle exchange programs in the world, and they boasted that, it was not reducing hepatitis C. People were still using dirty needles despite the availability of clean needles, and our hep C rates were like anywhere else in the world regardless. This was admitted by the gentleman within Australia that introduced needle and syringe programs in the first place in 1985, Dr. Alex Wodak. And he had boasted the fact that he started the whole harm reduction approach in 1985 by a bit of civil disobedience and starting up his own needle and syringe programs, despite them being considered illegal at the time. In a 1997 article in the Medical Journal of Australia, Dr. Alex Wodak laments that needle exchange has not been effective when it comes to hepatitis C. These are his own words. He says, despite the success of the harm reduction public health approach in controlling the HIV epidemic and slowing the spread of hepatitis B among IDUs, intravenous drug users in Australia, it appears not to have reduced the incidence of hepatitis C. And so he goes to call on Australians to bring in some other measures which have been successful with HIV advertising campaigns and so on TV. And that is his answer. But he is admitting that needle exchanges do not work for hepatitis C. If they're not working for hepatitis C because people are sharing dirty needles too much, then they're not working for HIV either. Even though he's claiming this is a success, it is not logical that if people are sharing dirty needles all the time, that it's going to have any effect on HIV either, which is another bloodborne disease. In 2017, there was an attempt to rescue the reputation of needle and syringe programs, and a Cochrane collaboration study was done at that time. And there are quite a few Australian names in here, and these are people that wanted to rescue its reputation. The problem with this Cochrane collaboration review is that it used very high risk studies that were at high risk of bias. And so within the text of this Cochrane collaboration, you'll notice that it says we judged only 2 studies to be at moderate overall risk of bias, while 17 were at serious risk and 7 were at critical risk. This study should never have been done. You don't use bias studies to create a Cochrane collaboration review, but a review they did. And they said as none of the intervention effects were generated from RCTs, random controlled trial evidence, we typically categorize quality as low. They should never have published this study, but they did it so that they could say to the politicians that we see some benefit to needle and syringe programs. And down here, also within the text, this is a direct a screenshot from the study itself. The evidence is considered low quality because it was derived from observational studies with serious risk of bias, and the few studies identified precluded sensitivity analyses. And so needle and syringe programs, you can be pretty much sure that they're not doing much within Australia to help with decreasing drug-related fatalities. Methadone programs, the same. Methadone programs were introduced in 1985 along with the needle exchange programs. And here is a Cochrane collaboration review. This one is actually well done, it looks at random controlled trials, and it was produced in 2009. And it was done by a person within Australia, Dr. Richard Maddock, is very much pro-harm reduction. But the results of his study was something that are really important for people to understand. Methadone programs do not do anything of any note to stop drug-related deaths within Australia or anywhere else in the world. And so what we see down here in the conclusions from this study, it says that opioid replacement therapy does not show a statistically significant superior effect on criminal activity or mortality. Now, these are the very things that methadone programs, we spend a lot of money in this country. And the reason that we have methadone programs is to reduce drug-related deaths and, of course, criminal activity that is associated with that. And what we see is that it doesn't do that according to this very important collaboration study. And what we see within Australia is that methadone, which is meant to be saving lives, is actually, here is the methadone line here on the graph from 2001 through to 2021. And you can see that methadone is involved in many Australians losing their lives. Harm reduction is not working for Australia. That is the important message that I think we need to get. Now, I just wanted, before I finish, just to talk a little bit about decriminalisation. We have a lot of pressure from the harm reduction lobby worldwide to decriminalise drugs as they did in Portugal back in 2001. And Portugal in 2001 implemented a new policy of dissuasion. That's what they called it. And the goal of dissuasion was to decrease illicit drug use. Now, did this work within Portugal? Here is a graph of their results up into 2017. This is lifetime use. People who said, I have used at some time an illicit drug during my lifetime. This is the graph. And you can see for 2001, a substantial people had used it, but in the last year, a lesser number had used in the previous 12 months. By 2007, lifetime use had gone up dramatically, and so had, well, not so much dramatically, but had increased a little the last year use. In 2012, lifetime use had gone down, and last year use had gone down as well. But then by 2007, you actually have reasonably dramatic increases, 62%, I think it's 61% increases over the time before decriminalisation. Now, what happened with young people in schools was very much the same kind of thing. So here is 1999 in the SPAD survey, in 2003. Drug use for these kids had gone up, decreased in 2007, then goes up by 2011, decreases again by 2019, but it is still above the time before decriminalisation. So drug use has increased. Were they able to dissuade people against drug use? The answer is no. It was not a success. And yet we have the harm reduction lobbies worldwide who are encouraging every country to take on the success of Portugal, because that's what they call it. When it comes to deaths, this is a really important indicator of the lack of success of the Portuguese experiment in decriminalisation. Now, what we know from wastewater data right across Europe, and they measure wastewater drugs that are in the wastewater across many cities in Europe, we actually see that Portugal figures as one of the main drug using countries in wastewater data. And so when it comes to cocaine, Portugal is in the top 4 countries. When it comes to ecstasy, it's in the top 5 countries. When it comes to cannabis found in the wastewater, it's in the top 4 countries. And when it comes to ketamine, it is in the top 4 countries. And so we can see that drug use is actually quite increased in Portugal, even though their graph only shows moderate increases. Now, when it comes to heroin use within that country, we can tell that the heroin use has been going up steeply, particularly since 2011. How do we know? Because their heroin or their opiate deaths are going up at a very steep rate as well. Thing about heroin use is that there is a fairly close relationship between increasing heroin use and deaths. It's a 1 to 100 relationship. So there is going to be an increase as you get 100 new users. There is going to be an increase in one death per 100 users as they increase. And so we know that in Portugal, heroin use is going up quite dramatically. This is a failed experiment that I would say that anybody in any country in the world has got to refuse and be aware of the facts. So just summarising our experience within Australia, harm reduction was related and correlated to vastly increasing deaths within this country. And as you can see from the first graph, it was almost becoming an exponential increase. What we saw was that tough on drugs brought about very steep decreases in drug use because of its emphasis on prevention and recovery. And yes, it is true that during this time of tough on drugs, that we still had needle exchanges and we still had methadone programs. But you think, well, without those programs, maybe we could have even had greater decreases because those programs only seem to be related to increases in dangers to drug users and to their mortality. And again, looking at the graph, after tough on drugs was scrapped and harm reduction became front and center again, prevention and recovery were given a back seat. We see every drug related death for every type of drug actually increased markedly. So just to finish off, if you want to get, this is a 60-page report. It has a lot of detail, has every bit of detail and every source of the stats which you see in this presentation is in this document. You can go to our Drug Free Australia website and you can click on resources, the resources tab, go down to the harm minimisation tab and then click on the name of this document, which is 3 down on the list. It is called Harm Reduction 2024. So just want to thank everybody for just being able to work your way through those stats. And I'm just going to let everybody speak now and just take any questions. And you should be able to be heard by now. And I'll just take this so that we can all see each other properly. So any questions? Okay, I think just if you want to unmute, You just may need to go. Now, to unmute, you need to go to the
Hello?
bottom
Hello?
left-hand corner. Yes, yes, Ismail.
Hi. I would like to know if you believe harm reduction strategies may be useful anyway, not as a public policy, but just like as a strategy.
Yes, okay, I think I can answer that one. And look, Drug Free Australia is supportive of harm reduction so long as it is being used as a pathway to recovery. All right. And you'll find that in all countries of the world, it is not used as a pathway to recovery, but as a pathway to continued drug use. And so we are against harm reduction being used as just to support drug use and foster drug use. And it is just the wrong thing. But if it is to get a person to recovery, it is a good thing. Now, there is some evidence that methadone does help people after they have been released from prison to not overdose at that time. So we're supportive of that. If it's being used again to get them off drugs, and we recognize that it has a role to play there and that studies do support that. But as you can see, overall evidence does not support it being successful overall.
Right. I agree with that.
Yes. Any other questions from our group?